The cold metal handcuffs bit into my wrists as Sheriff Sheila dragged me across my own front lawn. My neighbors stood frozen on their porches, their faces masks of shock and fear. The American flag that had proudly hung from my porch now lay crumpled in the dirt, torn down by her deputy with deliberate force. "You people never learn, do you?" Sheriff Sheila whispered in my ear, her voice dripping with contempt. "This is my town, my rules." "What law did I break?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my effort to remain calm. "Tell me what crime hanging a flag is." She yanked me toward the patrol car, a smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Disturbing the peace, unauthorized display, take your pick." As she shoved me into the back seat, I caught sight of Mrs. Wilson from across the street. Our eyes met, and she quickly looked away, retreating inside her home. That moment burned into my memory. The moment I realized this was not just about a flag or a power-hungry sheriff. This was about an entire town living in fear. I had moved to Pinecrest 3 months earlier, seeking refuge from the endless noise and pressure of city life. After 20 years working at a marketing firm in Chicago, the burnout had finally caught up with me. The doctor called it chronic stress and suggested a complete change of environment. When I found the listing for the modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, with its wraparound porch and view of rolling hills, it felt like destiny. The town itself seemed perfect, population just under 5,000, a charming main street with family-owned businesses, and a pace that allowed people to actually stop and breathe. My first week there, I learned the names of the barista at the coffee shop, the elderly couple who ran the hardware store, and the mailman who delivered with remarkable punctuality. This was the America I had been searching for: simple, honest, connected. On my second Sunday in town, I decided it was time to make the house truly mine. I unpacked the American flag that had hung outside every home I had ever lived in. It had been my father's tradition, a quiet symbol of the values he had instilled in me: freedom, integrity, and respect for the community we lived in. I mounted it carefully on the porch column, making sure it hung properly, free to wave in the gentle breeze that swept through Pinecrest most afternoons. That evening I sat on my porch with a glass of lemonade, watching as neighbors walked their dogs or pushed strollers past my house. Most nodded approvingly at the flag. A few even stopped to introduce themselves. Mr. Henderson from 2 doors down mentioned he was a Vietnam veteran and appreciated seeing Old Glory flying on the street. For the first time since arriving, I felt like I belonged. But not everyone seemed pleased. A silver-haired woman walking briskly past my house glanced at the flag, and her lips tightened visibly before she hurried along. Later that week, I noticed a black SUV with the county sheriff logo slow down as it passed my house. The driver, a woman with sharp features and mirrored sunglasses, seemed to study my property with unusual interest before accelerating away. I dismissed these observations at first. Small towns had their quirks and politics, just like any community. Perhaps the flag reminded some people of political divisions that had become so prominent in recent years. But my intentions were simple. This was about personal heritage, not political statements. The pattern continued throughout my first month. Most neighbors were warm and welcoming, inviting me to community events and offering recommendations for local services. But there was an undercurrent of something I could not quite identify. Conversations would sometimes halt when certain topics arose. People would glance over their shoulders before sharing opinions about local governance. On a Tuesday morning in early October, I was tending to the small garden I had started when the black sheriff's SUV returned, this time pulling directly into my driveway. The door opened, and out stepped a woman in a crisp uniform, her badge catching the morning sunlight. She moved with deliberate authority, her hand resting casually near her holstered weapon. "Good morning," I called out, setting down my gardening tools and removing my gloves. "Can I help you with something?" "Sheriff Sheila Blackwood," she replied, her tone professionally cold. "You are the new resident, correct? Moved in about a month ago." "That is right," I confirmed, extending my hand. She ignored it, instead letting her gaze drift pointedly toward my flag. "We have received some concerns about your display," she said. I followed her gaze, genuinely confused. "My flag, is there a problem with it?" Sheriff Sheila's expression hardened slightly. "Pinecrest has certain standards for community aesthetics and harmony. Some displays can be seen as provocative." The absurdity of her statement momentarily stunned me. The flag was standard size, properly mounted, and in perfect condition. It was identical to flags flown outside government buildings throughout the country. "I do not understand," I admitted. "This is an American flag. How could that possibly be provocative?" "I am not here to debate politics with you," she replied sharply. "Consider this a friendly visit, a suggestion to be mindful of how you present yourself in our community." With that, she turned and walked back to her vehicle. As she drove away, I noticed my elderly neighbor Mrs. Turner watching from her window. When our eyes met, she quickly closed her curtains. Something in her reaction sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. That night I could not sleep. Sheriff Sheila's friendly visit replayed in my mind. There had been nothing friendly about it. It was a warning, though for what I could not say. One thing was certain. In this quiet town I had chosen for peace, something was very wrong. 3 days after Sheriff Sheila's unsettling visit, I was sweeping leaves from my porch steps when her SUV returned. This time, she was not alone. A younger deputy followed in a separate patrol car, parking behind her at the curb. My stomach tightened as they approached in lockstep, their expressions grim and determined. "Good afternoon," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Several neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching the scene unfold with wary curiosity. Sheriff Sheila did not return the greeting. Instead, she produced an official-looking document from her pocket. "I am here regarding multiple violations of Municipal Order 47B, Section 12. She announced loudly enough for the gathering audience to hear. "I am sorry, but I have no idea what that is," I replied honestly. "Could you explain what violation you are referring to?" Her eyes narrowed. "Unauthorized display of material deemed disruptive to community standards. You were advised during my previous visit to reconsider your choices." I glanced at my flag, still waving gently in the breeze. "You mean the American flag? That is what this is about. There must be some mistake. This cannot possibly violate any legitimate ordinance." "Are you refusing to comply with a direct order from a peace officer?" Sheriff Sheila took a step closer, her hand moving to rest on her belt near her handcuffs. "I am not refusing anything," I clarified carefully. "I am simply asking for clarification about what law I have allegedly broken. Can you show me the specific ordinance?" The deputy shifted uncomfortably behind her, but Sheriff Sheila's confidence never wavered. "The ordinance protects this community from divisive and agitational symbols. Your continued resistance only confirms the disruptive intent behind your display." My heart was pounding now, but I maintained my composure. "Sheriff, with all due respect, I have the right to know specifically what law I have violated. The American flag is not a divisive symbol. It represents all of us. There are flags just like mine flying at the post office downtown." "Those are official government displays," she snapped. "Your mockery of procedure is now bordering on obstruction." She turned to her deputy. "Call for backup. We have an uncooperative subject." "Backup for what?" My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. "This is completely unnecessary. I am simply asking questions about my rights." Sheriff Sheila moved with practiced efficiency, grabbing my arm and spinning me around before I could process what was happening. "You are under arrest for violation of Municipal Order 47B and obstruction of justice." The cold metal of handcuffs closed around my wrists with a definitive click. Neighbors gasped. Someone called out, "This isn't right," but quickly fell silent when Sheriff Sheila turned her gaze in their direction. "Take down that flag," she ordered her deputy, who hesitated momentarily before reluctantly climbing my porch steps. "You cannot do this," I protested as she guided me firmly toward her vehicle. "This is my property. That flag is my personal property. You have no right." "I have every right," she interrupted, her voice low and menacing. "This is my town. I determine what is and is not acceptable here. Your kind always think the rules do not apply to you." "My kind," I echoed, genuinely confused. "What does that mean?" She said nothing more, roughly helping me into the backseat of her patrol car. Through the window, I watched as her deputy removed my flag, folding it haphazardly before placing it in a large evidence bag. The drive to the station was silent and tense. I tried to make sense of what was happening, to understand what line I had crossed in this town that had seemed so perfect just weeks ago. By the time we arrived at the small sheriff's department building, my confusion had given way to a simmering anger. Inside, I was processed like any other criminal, photographed, fingerprinted, my personal items cataloged and stored. When I again asked to see the ordinance I had allegedly violated, the booking officer avoided my gaze and mumbled something about the sheriff's discretion. After 2 hours in a holding cell, I was finally presented with charging documents. The offense listed was not the mysterious Municipal Order 47B, but rather public disturbance and failure to comply with peace officer directives. The description was vague, mentioning provocative display and community disruption without specifics. When I was finally permitted my phone call, I contacted the only person I knew in town well enough to ask for help, Sarah, the librarian who had helped me get settled when I first arrived. Her shock was evident even through the phone. "They arrested you for your flag," she whispered as though afraid of being overheard. That is not normal, even for Sheila." "Who is she?" I asked. "Why would she target me like this?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Sheila has been sheriff for 6 years. Things have changed since she took over. Listen, I will post your bail, but we cannot talk about this over the phone. Be careful what you say there." As I hung up, I caught the eye of a deputy watching me from across the room. He quickly looked away, but not before I recognized something in his expression. Not hostility, but fear. And somehow, that frightened me more than anything else that had happened that day. My release came shortly before midnight, with Sarah waiting anxiously in the station's small lobby. She hugged me briefly before hurrying me to her car, checking over her shoulder repeatedly as we left. Neither of us spoke until we were several blocks away. "This should never have happened," she finally said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "An American flag, it is absurd." "Does this happen often?" I asked. "People getting arrested for seemingly no reason?" Sarah sighed deeply. "Not exactly like this, but yes. Sheila has her own way of running things. People who do not fit her vision of what the town should be tend to have problems." The next morning, I walked to the local diner for breakfast, feeling the need to establish normalcy despite the surreal events of the previous day. The moment I entered, conversations halted. Eyes turned toward me, some curious, others nervous. The hostess, who had always greeted me with a warm smile, now avoided eye contact as she led me to a table. I had barely opened my menu when an older man in a faded veteran's cap approached. He glanced around furtively before sitting across from me. "Name's Frank," he said quietly. "Marine Corps, served 2 tours in Vietnam. Heard what happened yesterday." "Word travels fast," I observed. "Small town," he replied with a shrug. "Listen, I have lived here my whole life. Flown the flag outside my house for 40 years. Never had a problem until Sheila took over." "What changed?" I asked. Frank's expression darkened. "She brings her politics into everything, claims to be protecting community standards, but really she is just weeding out anyone who does not think like her. Started small, harassing certain businesses, selective enforcement of noise ordinances. Then it escalated." Before he could continue, the waitress approached. Frank stood quickly. "Just wanted to welcome you to town," he said at normal volume. "Think about what I said about that fishing spot." With a meaningful look, he returned to his own table. Throughout the day, I experienced the divided reaction of the town firsthand. The pharmacist whispered her support while filling my prescription. The man at the gas station pretended not to know me, though we had chatted amiably just days before. 2 women crossed the street to avoid passing me on the sidewalk. At the grocery store, I reached for a carton of eggs only to have another shopper deliberately bump into me. "Troublemaker," he muttered before walking away. Minutes later, a different shopper slipped me a folded note with a local phone number and the words "not alone, others like you." The most revealing encounter came at Pinecrest Hardware. As I browsed for supplies to repair a leaking faucet, the owner, Mr. Davis, approached cautiously. "Need help finding anything?" he asked loudly, then added in a much lower voice, "Back room 2 minutes." Following his instruction, I made my way to the store's rear storage area. Mr. Davis joined me moments later, closing the door behind him. "You need to watch yourself," he warned without preamble. "Sheila does not forget or forgive what she sees as challenges to her authority." "All I did was hang a flag," I protested. "It is not about the flag," he replied grimly. "It is about control. Before you came, someone else hung rainbow bunting during Pride Month. Their windows got broken 3 nights in a row. No investigation. The family that organized a climate change awareness event found their business licenses suddenly under review. They left town 6 months later." "That cannot be legal," I said. Mr. Davis gave a bitter laugh. "Legal? Who enforces the law here? Who do you complain to when the sheriff herself is the problem?" That evening, I sat alone in my flagless home, my laptop open before me. I began searching for information about Sheriff Sheila Blackwood. Local news articles showed her at community events, presenting a public image of dedicated service. But when I ventured into social media and community forums from neighboring towns, a different picture emerged. Comments about Pinecrest's problem and that power-hungry sheriff appeared frequently. People shared stories about moving away after encounters with her selective enforcement. One thread was titled simply, "Sheila's Hit List." I created an anonymous account and posted my own experience. Within hours, my inbox filled with private messages, some offering support, others sharing similar stories, a few warning me to leave town while I could. That night, I made a decision. I would not be intimidated into silence. I would not pack up and disappear as others had done. I began methodically documenting everything that had happened, researching relevant laws and compiling names of others who had experienced Sheila's particular brand of justice. The flag that had started it all might be gone, but what it stood for, freedom, justice, standing against tyranny, had never felt more important. Over the next 2 weeks, I transformed my dining room into an impromptu investigation center. Corkboards lined the walls, connected by red string to photographs, printed forum posts, and handwritten accounts from those brave enough to share their experiences. Each story revealed a disturbing pattern of intimidation and selective enforcement under Sheriff Sheila's administration. My online post had opened floodgates. Former residents of Pinecrest reached out daily, eager to finally have their experiences acknowledged. A family who had operated a bookstore for 3 generations described how Sheriff Sheila had instituted surprise safety inspections after they hosted an author whose political views she opposed. The inspections continued weekly until they sold the business and moved away. A young couple shared how their permit to hold a community farmers market was revoked when they declined to donate to Sheriff Sheila's re-election campaign. When they protested, their car was impounded for suspicious activity. Most disturbing were the accounts of those who had attempted to challenge her officially. A former deputy had filed a complaint about witnessing Sheriff Sheila planting evidence during a vehicle search. Within days, he was fired for performance issues. When he pursued legal action, his house was mysteriously burglarized, with only his case files taken. I created a secure online document where victims could anonymously record their experiences. The responses painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning Sheriff Sheila's entire tenure. The incidents ranged from petty harassment to serious civil rights violations, but the methodology remained consistent. Identify those who questioned her authority, make examples of them, and ensure the rest of the town got the message. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. The deputy who had accompanied Sheriff Sheila during my arrest stood on my porch, visibly nervous. "I am not here officially," he said quickly. I saw what happened, it was wrong." I invited him in cautiously, aware this could be a trap. He declined to sit, remaining near the door. "Sheriff Blackwood has been targeting people since she took office," he confessed. "Most deputies either go along with it or look the other way. The ones who speak up do not last long." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because it is getting worse," he replied, his voice dropping further. "She has connections, the mayor, 2 county commissioners, Judge Reynolds. They protect her and she enforces their version of community standards. Your arrest was different though, more public, more blatant. Some of us think she is becoming more reckless." Before leaving, he mentioned a retired judge who lived in the next county over, someone who had clashed with Sheila years earlier and might be willing to speak with me. 3 days later, I sat in former Judge Michael Harrington's living room, sharing what I had discovered. The elderly man listened intently, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. "Sheriff Blackwood's behavior does not surprise me," he said when I finished. "What surprises me is that it has continued this long without consequences." "How is that possible?" I asked. "From what I have gathered, she has violated numerous laws and civil rights protections." Judge Harrington leaned forward. "You have to understand the power structure here. Sheila has protection from above. Her cousin sits on the State Police Oversight Committee. Her former partner is now a senior official in the Attorney General's office. Complaints get buried. Investigations get stalled. So there is nothing that can be done." The thought was profoundly discouraging. "I did not say that," the judge replied with a hint of steel in his voice. "Power like hers depends on keeping violations isolated, maintaining plausible deniability. What you are doing, connecting the victims, documenting the pattern, that is exactly what they fear most." As I drove home that evening, a patrol car fell in behind me, following at a precise distance for several miles before turning away. The message was clear. I was being watched. That night, I carefully organized all the evidence I had collected: personal testimonies, dates of incidents, patterns of behavior, clear violations of constitutional rights. The story that emerged was not just about a corrupt sheriff. It was about an entire system of power built on intimidation and fear, a system that had silenced dissent for years. I searched through legal resources online, looking for precedents and protocols. I found cases where other corrupt officials had finally faced justice after their patterns of abuse were exposed. The common element was public pressure, situations where the evidence became too overwhelming, too public to ignore or bury. My computer dinged with an incoming email. A former town council member had sent me internal minutes from meetings where Sheriff Sheila had requested increased budgets for community monitoring and proactive enforcement. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was chilling. I added these documents to my growing collection, a sense of purpose solidifying within me. This was no longer just about my flag or my arrest. This was about a community living under authoritarian rule disguised as law enforcement. Something needed to be done, and I was increasingly certain I knew what that something was. After 3 weeks of compiling evidence, cross-referencing accounts, and consulting with Judge Harrington, I made my decision. Individual complaints against Sheriff Sheila had been systematically buried or dismissed. The local power structure protected her, but they could not silence hundreds of voices speaking in unison, backed by documented evidence. I spent 2 days recording and re-recording a 15-minute video. In it, I calmly recounted my own experience, then presented the pattern of abuses I had uncovered. I included redacted versions of official documents, anonymous testimonies, and a timeline of Sheriff Sheila's escalating violations. I was careful to present facts rather than accusations, letting the evidence speak for itself. The video ended with a simple request. If you have experienced similar treatment under Sheriff Blackwood's administration, please add your voice to this documentation effort. Only by standing together can we restore justice to Pinecrest. I posted the video to multiple platforms simultaneously: YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and several forums frequented by civil rights advocates and legal professionals. I shared it with local news outlets in neighboring counties, along with a comprehensive dossier of evidence. Then I waited. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By nightfall, the video had over 50,000 views. Comments poured in, many from current and former Pinecrest residents confirming my findings. Others came from civil liberties organizations offering support and legal guidance. Local news outlets in neighboring counties picked up the story first. Their coverage was cautious but curious: allegations of systematic civil rights violations in Pinecrest Sheriff's Department. National outlets followed within days, drawn by the compelling narrative of small-town corruption and the growing chorus of victims coming forward. Reporters began appearing in Pinecrest, conducting interviews with residents who had previously been too intimidated to speak out. With safety in numbers, people found courage. The bookstore owner, the farmers market organizers, dozens more whose stories had never been heard. On the fourth day, Sheriff Sheila held a press conference on the steps of the department building. Her uniform was impeccable, her expression stern and confident. The allegations being spread by a disgruntled outsider are categorically false, she declared to the assembled press. This individual came to our peaceful community with an agenda of disruption and division. When asked to comply with our community standards, he chose confrontation over cooperation. She went on to describe me as a professional agitator with questionable connections, and implied that I had a history of similar behavior in other communities. Every claim was fabricated, but delivered with such conviction that some media outlets reported them without verification. That afternoon, I found a citation for improper waste disposal on my door, though my trash bins were exactly where regulations required. The next morning, another citation appeared, this time for excessive lawn growth, despite my yard being freshly mowed. The message was clear. Sheila was escalating. Anonymous calls began coming to my phone. Some contained just silence, others muffled threats. My car was keyed in the grocery store parking lot, but for every act of intimidation, two acts of support emerged. Neighbors I had never spoken to left encouraging notes in my mailbox. A local attorney offered her services pro bono. Veterans organized a flag-raising ceremony in the town square. The most unexpected support came from within the sheriff's department itself. 3 deputies, including the one who had visited me earlier, publicly questioned Sheriff Sheila's version of events. They described a culture of fear and retaliation within the department, where following Sheriff Sheila's directives was prioritized over following the law. 1 week after I went public, a representative from the state attorney general's office arrived in Pinecrest. 2 days later, investigators from the FBI's Civil Rights Division followed. Sheriff Sheila's demeanor changed visibly. Her public statements became defensive rather than accusatory. Her patrol car no longer drove slowly past my house. When the local newspaper finally covered the story, after initially refusing to touch it, they included a powerful photograph. Dozens of American flags had appeared overnight on porches throughout Pinecrest, a silent statement of solidarity and defiance. That evening, as I documented the day's developments, my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was Mrs. Turner, my elderly neighbor who had hidden behind her curtains the day Sheriff Sheila first visited me. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My husband was a judge for 30 years. He always said that injustice thrives when good people stay silent. I stayed silent too long." She handed me a thick folder of handwritten notes, dates, times, incidents she had witnessed over 6 years of living across from Sheriff Sheila's house. Conversations overheard, suspicious visitors arriving late at night, patterns that suggested corruption far deeper than even I had uncovered. "What you started," she said, "is long overdue." As Mrs. Turner walked away, I glanced down the street. More flags had appeared on porches since morning. The wall of fear that had enclosed this town was beginning to crumble. The truth was finally emerging into the light, and not even Sheriff Sheila could arrest everyone for telling it. The first email arrived just after midnight. "Read this carefully," it began. "I worked with Sheila for 3 years before I quit. What happened to you is not an isolated incident." I sat up in bed, my laptop illuminating the darkness of my living room. The sender, anonymous, had attached scanned documents, internal complaints dating back 4 years, each one buried, each one describing similar encounters with Sheriff Sheila. Citizens intimidated, rights violated, voices silenced. By morning, my inbox had 3 more messages. Former residents who had moved away after confrontations with Sheila. Each story followed the same pattern: a symbol, a statement, or a question that challenged her authority, followed by swift and disproportionate punishment. "I had a sign supporting the wrong candidate," one woman wrote. 2 days later, my son was pulled over 3 times in 1 week. The message was clear. The breakthrough came when Celia Morris, an investigative reporter from the county newspaper, contacted me. She had been collecting stories about Sheila for years, but could never find someone willing to go on record. People are terrified of her, Celia explained as we sat in a coffee shop 2 towns over. She spoke in hushed tones despite the distance. But you opened the floodgates. Look at this. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of sealed complaints, documents that should have triggered internal investigations, but had mysteriously disappeared from county records. How did you get these? I asked. Let us just say someone inside the courthouse had a crisis of conscience, she replied. There is a pattern here. Sheila targets specific types of expression. Flags, signs, bumper stickers, anything that conflicts with her personal politics disappears. And if you complain, you become the next target. That afternoon, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. Do not say my name, the voice said immediately. I still work in the department. Meet me at the old fire tower access road. Come alone. 7 tonight. The former deputy called himself John. He stood in the shadow of his pickup truck, constantly scanning the tree line as we talked. 20 years on the force, he explained, and he had never seen anything like Sheila's administration. She keeps 2 sets of records, he said, handing me a thumb drive. Official reports get sanitized. The real information, the notes on who to watch, who to pressure, that stays in her private files. I have been copying what I could for months. Why not take this higher? I asked. Because she has friends at the state level, he replied, his voice tight with frustration. Complaints disappear. Investigators get reassigned. Nobody wants to touch it. He looked at me directly for the first time. But you went public. You bypassed the system she controls. The thumb drive contained audio recordings. Sheila's voice, unmistakable, directing officers to conduct unlawful searches, instructing them to target specific individuals, laughing about teaching lessons to troublemakers. We will do whatever it takes to maintain order in my town, her voice declared in one recording. If that means making examples of certain people, so be it. I contacted every person mentioned in the files. Most refused to speak, fear still controlling them. But 3 agreed to meet. A former council member who had questioned her budget, a business owner who had hosted a community forum she disapproved of, and a high school teacher who had organized a student protest. Each confirmed the pattern: selective enforcement, fabricated violations, escalating harassment until they fell silent. She does not just enforce the law, the teacher told me, voice trembling even years later. She decides what the law means depending on who you are and what you believe. The evidence mounted: reports of traffic stops without cause, property inspections targeting specific homes, permits denied without explanation. With everything compiled, testimonies, documents, audio recordings, I contacted Sarah Lynn, a civil rights attorney who had successfully challenged law enforcement abuses in neighboring counties. This is not just about your flag, she said after reviewing my dossier for 2 hours. This is about the systematic suppression of First Amendment rights under color of law. And yes, we absolutely have a case. As I drove home that night, a patrol car appeared in my rearview mirror. It followed me for 3 miles, lights off, just close enough to be noticed. The message was clear. Sheila knew, and she was watching. But it was too late for intimidation. The truth was no longer mine alone to protect or expose. It belonged to dozens of victims, years of evidence, and now, the legal system she had manipulated for so long. Tomorrow, we would file the lawsuit that would begin her downfall. The courthouse steps gleamed in the morning sun as Sarah Lynn laid out our strategy. We are filing 3 separate actions, she explained. First, a federal civil rights lawsuit under Section 1983 for your wrongful arrest. Second, a petition for injunctive relief to immediately limit her enforcement authority. Third, a motion to unseal all internal investigation records related to Sheriff Sheila's department over the past 5 years. Reporters gathered at the base of the steps, not just local papers now, but regional television stations. The story had grown beyond our small town. "This case is not about a flag," Sarah announced to the cameras. "It is about a pattern of constitutional violations carried out systematically against citizens who express viewpoints disfavored by local authorities. We intend to prove that Sheriff Sheila has weaponized law enforcement to silence protected speech." The sheriff's response came within hours. A press release dismissing our claims as politically motivated attacks by outside agitators. But her actions spoke louder than her words. Patrol cars suddenly appeared everywhere in town, outside the homes of those who had spoken to me, circling my neighborhood hourly, parking across from Sarah's temporary office. "She is trying to intimidate witnesses," Sarah explained when I called her, concerned. "It is actually helpful to our case. Document every instance." 3 days after we filed, the community's fear began to crack. Mrs. Henderson, the librarian who had watched my arrest from her porch, left a pie on my doorstep with a note. "I will testify." The owner of the hardware store nodded to me for the first time in weeks and whispered, "About time someone stood up to her." Small gestures of defiance spread throughout town. American flags appeared on porches that had been bare for years. Signs supporting various causes, environmental, political, religious, emerged in windows and yards, each one a small act of courage. Sheila's response was immediate and severe. Citations issued for non-compliant signage, tickets for improper display of national symbols, warnings about unpermitted public communication. "She is overplaying her hand," Sarah said when I forwarded the reports flooding my inbox. "Keep collecting evidence. The more aggressive she becomes, the stronger our case." On the morning of our first hearing, I arrived at the courthouse to find something unexpected. The street was lined with people, dozens, then hundreds. Some held flags identical to mine. Others carried signs. "Free speech is not a crime and no sheriff is above the law." Mark Evans, a Vietnam veteran I had met at the diner, organized the gathering. "When they took your flag," he said, standing tall despite his cane, "they took a piece of what I fought for. We are not letting this stand." Inside the courtroom, Judge Harriet Monroe listened silently as Sarah presented our motion for preliminary injunction. She detailed the pattern of selective enforcement, the testimonies of intimidation, the sealed records of complaints. Sheila's attorney, a sharp-suited man from the state capitol, argued that these were isolated incidents, exaggerated claims, the natural friction of law enforcement in a small community. Then Sarah played the audio recordings. Sheila's voice filled the courtroom. "I do not care about probable cause. Find something, anything on the Parker property. They need to learn they cannot put up those signs in my town." Another recording. "If the Veteran Association wants to make trouble with their little protest, start checking their cars. Someone is bound to have a tail, light out, or expired registration." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Monroe removed her glasses slowly. "These recordings," she said carefully, "appear to demonstrate a troubling pattern of directed enforcement based on protected speech. I am granting the preliminary injunction, effective immediately." The judge's order was clear. Sheriff Sheila could not enforce any ordinances related to displays, symbols, signs, or expressions without prior review by the court. Any arrest involving speech-related activities required judicial approval before charges could be filed. The crowd outside erupted when Sarah announced the ruling. People embraced, some weeping openly. A weight had been lifted, not completely, but enough to breathe again. That evening, as the sun set, I watched from my porch as neighbors emerged from their homes. They gathered in small groups, talking freely for the first time in years. Children played in front yards that had been silent. Mrs. Henderson waved to me from across the street, smiling as she hung a small flag beside her door. Sheila's patrol car appeared at the end of the block, moving slowly past the gathering. People noticed but did not scatter as they once would have. Instead, they stood their ground, watching as the car eventually drove away. "This is just the beginning," Sarah had warned me. "She will not go quietly. Be prepared for her to escalate before this is over." She was right. The next morning I found my car windows smashed, glass scattered across my driveway. No other cars on the street had been touched. Nothing was stolen, just a message, one final attempt at intimidation. But it was too late for threats. The silence was broken, and a town that had lived in fear was finding its voice again. The monthly town council meeting was standing room only. Citizens who had never attended before packed the small chamber, many wearing American flag pins or ribbons, small symbols of solidarity that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Sheriff Sheila sat stiffly at the side table reserved for department heads, her uniform pressed to perfection, her face a practiced mask of professional detachment. Only the constant tapping of her finger against her leg betrayed her tension. I sat in the back row beside Sarah, watching as resident after resident approached the microphone during public comments. They spoke of canceled permits for community events, businesses inspected repeatedly after displaying the wrong campaign signs, a senior citizen ticketed for an unauthorized gathering when he hosted a veteran support group in his garage. Each story eroded Sheila's carefully constructed facade a little more. Her finger tapped faster, her jaw tightened visibly. When Council Member Roberts asked about the pending lawsuit and injunction, Sheila leaned forward to respond. Her words were measured, rehearsed. The department remains committed to public safety and equal enforcement of all municipal codes. The allegations represent an unfortunate misunderstanding of proper police procedure. Roberts pressed further. Yet Judge Monroe found sufficient evidence to issue an injunction. How do you explain the audio recordings submitted to the court? Sheila's composure cracked slightly. Those recordings were obtained illegally and lack proper context. My officers follow my directives to maintain order in a community increasingly divided by outside influences and disruptive elements. As the discussion moved to budget matters, Sheila leaned back and muttered something to Deputy Harris beside her. She believed her microphone was off. It was not. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber speakers. "This is what happens when you let these flag-waving dissidents push their agenda. Mark my words, when this is over, we will clean house. Every one of them." The room fell silent. Sheila realized her error immediately, her face draining of color as she reached for the microphone switch. Too late, the words hung in the air. Council Chair Martinez cleared his throat. "Sheriff, would you care to clarify that statement for the record?" "I was simply expressing frustration with the procedural challenges we faced during this difficult period," she attempted. But her explanation fell flat against the naked truth of her hot mic moment. By morning, someone had uploaded the audio clip to social media. Local news stations played it on repeat. Regional papers ran headlines. "Sheriff vows to clean house of flag-waving dissidents," and Hot Mike catches sheriff's true attitudes toward constitutional rights. The clip reached state officials who had previously ignored complaints. The governor's office issued a statement expressing serious concern about the apparent abuse of authority. The state attorney general announced that his office would conduct an independent review of the sheriff's department operations. Sarah called me early the next morning. "This changes everything," she said. "We have been contacted by 3 former deputies willing to testify. They were afraid before, but the recording has broken the dam." By afternoon, county commissioners had called an emergency session. Their announcement was measured but unmistakable. Pending the outcome of state and internal investigations, oversight of departmental operations will be temporarily modified. Sheriff's Department policies will require commission approval until further notice. Sheila's authority, while not officially suspended, had been effectively curtailed. That evening I received an unexpected visitor. Deputy Miller, a 20-year veteran of the department who had always seemed like one of Sheila's loyal officers, stood on my porch, hat in hand. "I need to show you something," he said quietly. Inside his folder were departmental memos, handwritten notes, and a list of names, citizens marked for special attention. My name had been added recently, with notations about surveillance schedules and pressure points that could be exploited. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Miller looked down. "I joined the force to protect people. What she has been doing. It is not law enforcement, it is persecution. I should have spoken up sooner." When I asked why he had not, his answer was simple and devastating. "She kept files on us too, personal information, mistakes we made, things that could end careers or worse. She made sure we knew she had them." The next morning, as I met with Sarah to review Deputy Miller's documents, breaking news interrupted our session. The state police had entered the sheriff's department headquarters with warrants for departmental records. Simultaneous warrants were being executed at Sheila's home and private office. "They are looking for the personal files," Sarah explained. "The blackmail material Miller told you about." By evening, 3 state-level agencies had announced formal investigations. The Bureau of Investigation, the Attorney General's Public Integrity Unit, and the Law Enforcement Standards Commission. Sheila held an impromptu press conference in the parking lot of the department, her voice tight with barely controlled rage as cameras surrounded her. "This politically motivated witch hunt will not stand," she declared. "I have served this community with distinction for years. These false allegations will be proven baseless." But as she spoke, her once loyal deputies stood in the background, their faces carefully blank, their eyes averted. The power she had wielded through fear was evaporating in the harsh light of scrutiny. The empire she had built was beginning to crumble, brick by corrupt brick. The county commission's emergency session lasted well past midnight. Citizens filled every seat, lined the walls, and spilled into the hallways. The atmosphere was electric, a community witnessing its own liberation in real time. Chairman Martinez called the session to order with unprecedented gravity. "In light of the evidence presented to this commission and the ongoing state investigations, we are faced with an extraordinary decision regarding the administration of our sheriff's department." The vote was unanimous. Sheriff Sheila would be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of multiple investigations. Command would transfer temporarily to Captain Reynolds, a respected veteran officer who had largely remained in the background during Sheila's reign. Sheila was not present for the vote. She had been formally served with investigative subpoenas earlier that day, state investigators demanding access to her private records, emails, and the alleged special files she had maintained on citizens and officers alike. The next morning, the scene at the sheriff's department headquarters was surreal. State officials supervised as Sheila's personal items were removed from her office. Her nameplate came down. Her parking space was reassigned. The physical dismantling of her authority happened with remarkable swiftness. Sarah called me with updates throughout the day. 4 more deputies have come forward, she reported, each one confirming the pattern of targeted enforcement and retaliation. The state investigators cannot keep up with the volume of testimony. Former Deputy John Mercer was the first to go public. He sat for a televised interview, his face no longer hidden in shadow. "We were instructed to maintain separate records," he explained to the reporter. "Official reports that would pass legal scrutiny, and unofficial notes on who opposed the sheriff politically and how they could be pressured to fall in line." Deputy Miller followed, then others. The stories they told painted a picture of systematic corruption, fabricated violations, evidence planted during traffic stops, selective enforcement based on political signs or bumper stickers. Most damning were the accounts of internal retaliation. Officers who questioned orders found themselves assigned to overnight shifts, denied promotions, or subjected to baseless internal investigations. Those who complied were rewarded with favorable schedules and overlooked misconduct. "She cultivated absolute loyalty through fear," Miller explained during his deposition. "We all knew what happened to people who crossed her." By the end of the week, state investigators had compiled enough evidence for preliminary findings. The Attorney General held a press conference announcing that his office would pursue criminal charges against Sheriff Sheila for official misconduct, evidence tampering, civil rights violations, and abuse of public office. The evidence suggests a years-long pattern of corrupt practices designed to suppress constitutionally protected activities and retaliate against citizens based on their political expressions, he stated solemnly. "Such behavior represents the antithesis of what we expect from those entrusted with enforcing our laws." Sheila's response came through her attorney, a terse statement claiming political persecution and promising a vigorous defense. But her words carried none of the intimidating power they once had. Without her badge and authority, she was just another defendant facing serious charges. The floodgates truly opened when the court unsealed the internal investigation records we had petitioned for. Hundreds of civilian complaints, previously hidden or dismissed, became public record. The local newspaper published them in a special section that ran for 3 consecutive days. Citizens who had suffered in isolation discovered they were part of a larger pattern. People who had moved away returned to file statements. The lawsuit Sarah had filed on my behalf expanded to include dozens of plaintiffs, each with their own story of intimidation and rights violations. Captain Reynolds, now interim sheriff, addressed the department with remarkable candor. "We have lost the trust of our community," he told the assembled officers. "Rebuilding that trust must be our priority. From this day forward, we enforce the law equally, regardless of politics, religion, or personal expression." The State Police Standards Commission announced a comprehensive review of the department's policies and training. Experts in constitutional policing were brought in to retrain officers. Community oversight committees were formed to ensure transparency moving forward. 3 weeks after her suspension, Sheila was formally arrested. The images of her surrender, no longer in uniform but in civilian clothes, hands cuffed behind her back, dominated local media. She moved through the processing procedures she had once administered, her expression frozen in disbelief. The grand jury indictment listed 47 separate counts, spanning 6 years of misconduct. Each count represented a citizen whose rights had been violated, an officer coerced into unethical behavior, or evidence manipulated to serve her agenda. As more victims came forward, civil lawsuits mounted. The county insurance provider warned that settlements could reach into the millions, a devastating financial blow to our small community, but a necessary reckoning for years of unchecked abuse. At a community forum organized to discuss healing and reform, Mrs. Henderson, the librarian who had left me that pie with her note offering to testify, summed up the town's collective experience. "For years we lived in fear of our own police," she said, her voice strengthening as she spoke. "We censored ourselves. We took down our signs and flags. We stopped gathering. We stopped speaking freely. We surrendered our rights inch by inch, day by day. Now we must reclaim not just our constitutional freedoms but our courage to exercise them." The applause that followed was not celebratory but resolute, a community pledging never again to be silenced by those sworn to protect them. The morning after Sheila's arraignment, I stood on my front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise illuminate my neighborhood. The American flag above me fluttered gently in the breeze, its colors vibrant against the pale blue sky. No patrol cars slowed as they passed. No neighbors averted their eyes. The simple normalcy of the moment felt like a profound victory. 6 months had passed since my arrest. 6 months of evidence gathering, legal filings, public hearings, and gradually healing. Our town was different now, wounded by the revelations of corruption, but slowly finding its way toward recovery. The mail carrier approached with a package and several letters. "More of these today," she said with a smile, handing me the bundle. "Every day more come." Since Sheila's arrest, I had received hundreds of letters. Some came from nearby towns where similar patterns of intimidation had emerged. Others traveled from across the country, veterans, civil liberties advocates, ordinary citizens thanking me for taking a stand. I opened the first envelope at my kitchen table. Inside was a handwritten note from a teacher in a neighboring county. I took down my classroom displays about the Constitution 3 years ago after Sheriff Sheila visited our school and made comments about appropriate educational content, she wrote. "Yesterday, I put them back up. My students deserve to know their rights. Thank you for helping make that possible again." Another letter contained a photograph of an elderly couple standing proudly beside a flag identical to mine. "Married 51 years," their note read. "Both served in the military. Have not felt safe flying our flag since 2019. Today it flies again." The stories continued, small acts of reclaimed freedom, one household at a time. Each letter represented not just support for my case, but someone finding their own courage to exercise rights long suppressed. Captain Reynolds, still serving as interim sheriff while a special election was organized, had implemented sweeping reforms. Body cameras became mandatory. Civilian complaint procedures were simplified and made transparent. Officers received intensive training on constitutional rights and proper use of discretion. Most importantly, the culture of fear was dissolving. Community forums, once dangerous gatherings that would draw Sheila's attention, now happened regularly with departmental participation. Citizens spoke freely at town meetings. Signs and symbols of all viewpoints appeared throughout the community without repercussion. Sarah called that afternoon with an update on our case. "The county has agreed to settlement discussions," she reported. "The new commissioners recognize that fighting these cases would only prolong the community's pain. They want to make amends and move forward." The proposed settlement included not just financial compensation for victims, but institutional reforms, community oversight mechanisms, and public acknowledgement of the constitutional violations that had occurred. This is not just about money, Sarah emphasized. This is about ensuring the abuses cannot happen again. Later that week, I received an invitation from the local veterans of Foreign Wars Post. They requested that I speak at their monthly meeting about my experience. I had declined similar invitations in the past, uncomfortable with being viewed as some kind of hero. This time, I accepted. The VFW hall was packed beyond capacity when I arrived. Veterans of every age filled the chairs, some in uniform, others wearing caps or pins identifying their service. Commander Wilson, who had served in Desert Storm, introduced me with unexpected emotion. "What happened to our neighbor here reminded us of something essential," he said. "The freedoms we fought for overseas must be defended here at home, sometimes in the quietest ways, by ordinary citizens who simply refuse to be silenced." Standing at the podium, facing those who had sacrificed for the very freedoms Sheila had attempted to suppress, I found myself struggling for words. I was not an activist or a constitutional scholar, just someone who had hung a flag and refused to take it down. I did not set out to challenge authority or expose corruption, I began finally. I simply believed I had the right to express myself through a symbol that means a great deal to me. What I discovered was that rights unexercised become rights lost. Silence becomes permission. And sometimes, the most patriotic act is simply refusing to be intimidated. The applause was thunderous, but it was the conversations afterward that meant the most. Veterans shared their own stories of watching freedoms erode in our town. They spoke of relief that the intimidation had ended and determination that it never return. As autumn turned to winter, our community continued its slow healing. Sheila's criminal trial was scheduled for spring. The civil settlement was being finalized. Interim Sheriff Reynolds announced he would run in the special election, promising to maintain the reforms that had begun under his leadership. On crisp December mornings, I still began each day on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood awaken. American flags now flew from at least a dozen homes visible from my vantage point, not as political statements, but as quiet affirmations of reclaimed liberty. Mrs. Henderson waved from across the street as she collected her newspaper. The veteran with the cane nodded as he walked his dog past my yard. A school bus stopped at the corner, children chattering freely as they climbed aboard. These ordinary moments, a community living without fear, were the true victory. My flag still flies, but more importantly, so do many others. Different symbols, different beliefs, different expressions, all equally protected as they always should have been. What began as one person's stand against injustice had revealed a deeper truth. Our rights are never more vulnerable than when we are afraid to exercise them, and never more powerful than when we defend them together.